Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for a deep dive that might just turn what you thought you knew about nutrition on its head?
Always up for a good challenge, especially when it comes to busting medical myths.
Well, get ready, because today we're tackling a topic that's way more nuanced and honestly way more interesting than it might seem at first glance: how we feed people in the ICU.
Intensive care nutrition, you say. Sounds like a recipe for some lively debate.
Oh, you know it. We're dissecting a fascinating research review from 2024, so it's hot off the presses, called, wait for it, Nutrition in the Intensive Care Unit from the Acute Phase to Beyond.
Okay, catchy title. I'm intrigued. Lay it on me. What's got you so fired up about this particular review?
Because it completely changed how I think about feeding people, especially when they're seriously ill. For years, we've operated under this assumption: more nutrition, especially early on, equals better outcomes. Gotta fuel those healing processes.
Right, like the feed a cold, starve a fever kind of logic. But for critically ill patients, load them up with calories and protein seems like a no-brainer.
Exactly. But this review throws some serious shade on that whole more is always better mentality. It suggests that our feed them up approach in the ICU might actually be doing more harm than good in some cases.
Whoa, now that's a bold statement. I can see why you wanted to unpack this.
Yeah.
Where do we even begin to unravel this?
Well, let's start with the basics. Why did we ever think cramming calories was the way to go in the ICU? What's the logic behind that approach?
It kind of makes sense on the surface, right? Think about what happens when someone's critically ill. Their body goes into overdrive, but not in a good way. It starts breaking down muscle for energy, a process called catabolism.
Okay, catabolism, got it. Burning through reserves for fuel because the body is under immense stress.
Exactly. And we always saw this muscle wasting as a bad thing naturally. So the thought process was, let's counteract that by providing extra calories and protein. Flood the system with nutrients to make up for what's being lost.
Like, they're running on fumes, let's top off the tank stat. Seems logical.
Right. And to complicate matters further, many of those early studies on ICU nutrition we're talking decades ago linked poor nutrition to worse outcomes for patients. So it seemed to back up this idea that we needed to be aggressive with feeding.
Okay, so we've got this seemingly logical rationale: prevent muscle wasting, provide fuel for recovery, and some early research that seems to support it. So where did we go wrong? Because you're saying this review challenges that whole line of thinking.
Precisely. It turns out those early studies didn't fully account for a critical factor: how well a patient could tolerate being fed in the first place. Having trouble with feeding, whether it's through an IV or a feeding tube, could be a sign of how sick someone is, right?
So it's not necessarily that the lack of nutrition was directly causing worse outcomes, but rather that those patients who couldn't tolerate feeding were already much sicker.
Exactly. It's a classic case of correlation not equaling causation. Just because two things happen around the same time doesn't mean one caused the other.
Uh-huh. So it's like saying everyone caught in the rain is sad. Maybe they were sad before the rain started?
Perfect analogy. And that's where a groundbreaking study called ePanic comes in. Back in 2011, it really shook the medical world by challenging this very foundation of early high-dose feeding in the ICU.
I'm sensing this ePanic study was a big deal. What did they do differently? What made it so groundbreaking?
They took a group of critically ill adults and randomly assigned them to receive either full parenteral nutrition that's feeding directly into the bloodstream, or a more wait-and-see approach, more conservative. Now remember, everyone back then thought early, full nutrition was the gold standard.
Right. The sooner we can start providing those nutrients, the better. At least that's what we all thought.
Exactly. But here's the kicker. The patients who received that aggressive early feeding, those who got all those nutrients right off the bat, actually ended up with longer stays in the ICU. Not just that, they had more complications too, things like infections.
Wow. So trying to speed up recovery by piling on the nutrients backfired. Talk about unexpected consequences.
It totally flipped the script. And get this, some patients even had negative long-term effects from this early gung-ho feeding strategy. Like years later, they weren't bouncing back the way everyone had expected.
Okay, now that is seriously thought-provoking. It's like we went in with the best of intentions, but might have inadvertently made things worse. So what happened next? Did this study change clinical practice overnight? Did everyone just slam on the brakes with early high-dose feeding after ePanic? Not exactly a screeching halt, but it definitely got people thinking, that's for sure. ePanic was a real wake-up call.
Oh, absolutely. It threw a wrench in the whole more is always better approach to feeding in the ICU. Suddenly, researchers were asking a lot more questions.
Like what? What kind of questions came up after the study?
Well, for starters, they started questioning not just when we feed critically ill patients, but also how much.
Ah, so it wasn't just about the timing of the nutrition, but also the dose. Makes sense.
Exactly. And this review highlights some key studies that came out of that shift in thinking.
Okay, so walk us through it. What were researchers looking at specifically?
Well, one of the big questions was whether the delivery method mattered. Remember, ePanic looked at parenteral nutrition feeding directly into the bloodstream.
Right, through an IV.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, naturally, researchers wanted to know if we feed directly into the stomach, called enteral nutrition, would that make a difference?
So, same question about early high-dose feeding, but a different route of delivery. What did they find?
Well, a large trial called Calories tackled this head-on back in 2014. And guess what? It showed that whether a patient got enteral or parenteral nutrition, it didn't actually impact their recovery,
So it wasn't about how the nutrients got in.
as long as the total number of calories provided was the same.
Interesting. So how much was more important than how? Were there other studies that backed this up?
Oh, absolutely. The review mentioned several others: Eden, Permit, Target, all designed a bit differently, but they all seem to point to a similar conclusion.
Which is?
Higher doses of nutrition, regardless of whether it's enteral or parenteral, just didn't seem to offer any benefits.
Hmm. And you even said it might cause harm in some cases?
Yeah, hinted at harm is how they phrased it in the review.
Okay, so back up for a second. When you say hinted at harm, what kind of harm are we talking about here?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, we don't have a clear-cut answer yet. The research suggests this harm is what we call dose-dependent,
Dose dependent. So meaning,
meaning there's a tipping point, right?
yeah.
Where giving more nutrients stops being helpful and might actually start to backfire.
Instead of helping the body recover, we might be adding fuel to the fire with all these extra calories.
It's a possibility. And it's especially concerning when you consider that even patients considered high risk,
Yeah.
those more likely to experience complications, they didn't benefit from early high-dose feeding either.
So where does this leave us? We've been doing things this way for years, decades even, and now it seems like we might have had it wrong the whole time.
It's definitely a shift in thinking, that's for sure. But that just makes it all the more important to understand what's really going on.
Exactly. If simply force-feeding more isn't the answer, then what is? What's actually happening inside the body during a critical illness that makes it unable to use all those extra nutrients effectively?
Now, those are the million-dollar questions. And that's where we dive into the really fascinating stuff, the cellular mechanisms that might explain this unexpected response to high-dose feeding.
Okay, I'm ready. Hit me with the science. But maybe go easy on the jargon. I'm no biochemist. All right, so riddle me this. If giving extra fuel to a critically ill person isn't always the answer, then what's the deal with our bodies? What's happening at a cellular level that makes all this extra nutrition backfire?
That's where things get really interesting. The review highlights three main mechanisms at play. And honestly, this is where I geek out a little bit.
Oh, I'm all ears. Geek out away.
Okay, so the first one is this concept called anabolic resistance.
Anabolic resistance. Okay, that sounds kind of intimidating. Break it down for me.
Basically, it means that when your body's in a state of critical illness, it temporarily loses its ability to use nutrients the way it normally would. It can't build and repair tissues as efficiently, even if you're giving it all the building blocks.
So it's like, even if you're offering all the bricks and mortar, the body's construction crew is temporarily out of commission.
A perfect analogy. Now, the second mechanism is even more intriguing, in my opinion. It turns out that when you fast, and I don't mean skipping breakfast, I mean really fasting, your body activates this amazing internal cleanup crew. It's called autophagy.
Autophagy, I've heard that term before. That's like a cellular deep clean, right? Way more than just a juice cleanse.
Way cooler. Think of it like taking out the cellular trash, clearing out all the damaged parts of cells. It helps your body recycle resources more efficiently, which is crucial when it's trying to heal.
So our bodies are even more resourceful than we realize. They have backup systems in place, and fasting helps kickstart this process.
Exactly. And it's not just about cleaning up the waste. Alongside autophagy, there's another process that gets activated during fasting: ketogenesis.
Ketogenesis, like the keto diet.
Exactly. It's where your body starts producing ketones, which are an alternative fuel source. The brain loves ketones, especially when glucose is in short supply.
So we've got a backup energy source ready to go. We're designed to handle these periods of scarcity.
Precisely. And these fasting-induced processes, both autophagy and ketogenesis, seem to be super important for recovery. But, and here's the kicker, early High-dose nutrition can actually suppress them.
Hold on. So, by trying to be proactive and feed someone quickly, we might actually be hindering the body's natural healing mechanisms. That's counterintuitive.
It is counterintuitive, but that seems to be what the research suggests. And then there's the third mechanism, which has to do with blood sugar and insulin.
Right, because when we force feed, especially with lots of easy to digest carbs, it can send blood sugar soaring.
Exactly. That's hyperglycemia. And to compensate, the body has to pump out more insulin to try and control that sugar surge.
Which, in a healthy person, is fine, right? Insulin's just doing its job.
Right. But in a critically ill patient, it can be problematic. Having too much insulin floating around can actually cause its own set of issues. It's like overloading the system.
So we're essentially slamming the gas pedal on a system that's already overwhelmed, forcing it into overdrive when it needs a more measured approach.
That's a great way to put it. It's all about balance. And as it turns out, achieving that balance is a lot more nuanced than we initially thought.
That's for sure. Okay, so we've established that the old feed 'em up approach might not be the best way to go, but we can't just stop feeding critically ill patients altogether, can we? What's the alternative? Where do we go from here?
Right. We can't just swing the pendulum completely in the other direction. Prolonged fasting has its own risks. But it's not about extremes. It's about finding a more personalized and nuanced approach. And the research is heading in some fascinating directions.
Personalized nutrition. I feel like that's everywhere these days. Personalized medicine, personalized diets. What does that even look like in the context of the ICU?
Well, for starters, this review suggests that we might want to shift our focus to interventions that begin a little later in the patient's ICU stay, after that initial, really acute phase of their illness has passed.
So, like, give the body a chance to stabilize first. Let the dust settle before we start rebuilding.
Exactly. It doesn't mean withholding all nutrition, but maybe starting more conservatively. And then, as the patient shows signs of being able to handle more, we can gradually increase.
Okay, so a more measured approach. What else are researchers looking at in terms of personalizing nutrition in the ICU?
One really important area is finding better ways to monitor an individual's response to feeding. Right now, we rely a lot on general markers like blood sugar, protein levels, things like that. But those don't give us the full picture.
So what we really need are more tools to understand what's happening metabolically on a case-by-case basis.
Exactly. Imagine if we had a way to measure a patient's nutritional readiness, some way to tell precisely when their body is primed and ready to use nutrients effectively. That would be a game changer.
It would really take the guesswork out of it. Instead of assuming everyone needs the same thing, we could tailor our approach based on what their body is telling us.
Exactly. Now, that kind of testing is still in the future, but it highlights the direction we need to be moving in toward truly individualized nutrition.
So many exciting possibilities. Anything else on the horizon in terms of new research?
Well, this review also mentions some more unconventional approaches that are being explored. Things like intermittent fasting, maybe even ketogenic diets, but adapted for the ICU setting.
Wow. So instead of that constant drip of nutrition, we're talking about strategically timing when we give nutrients, maybe even cycling between periods of feeding and fasting to take advantage of those cellular cleanup crews we talked about earlier.
Precisely. And again, this is a very new area of research, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
This whole deep dive just reminds me of how important it is to constantly be questioning our assumptions, especially in medicine. What we think is true today might be completely different tomorrow.
Absolutely. And this deep dive really highlights how much we still don't know. We've been studying nutrition for centuries, but it's clear that we've still got a lot to learn about how the body responds to feeding, especially during a critical illness.
Speaking of things we're still figuring out, what about micronutrients? We've talked a lot about the macronutrients, carbs, protein, fats, but what about the vitamins and minerals? How do those factor into all of this?
Such a crucial point. This review emphasizes that critical illness doesn't just increase the body's need for calories and protein. The demand for micronutrients, those essential vitamins and minerals, also shoots way up.
Which makes sense, right? If your body's working overtime to heal and recover, it's going to need more of everything. But why is it so hard to get this right? Why is it so tricky to figure out exactly what critically ill patients need in terms of micronutrients?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is that those standard blood tests we use to measure micronutrient levels, they aren't very reliable in critically ill patients.
Because they're so sick.
Exactly. Inflammation, which is a hallmark of critical illness, it can really throw off those readings. So it's hard to get an accurate picture of what's truly going on.
So we're essentially working in the dark when it comes to knowing exactly which vitamins or minerals a patient might be deficient in.
In a way, yes. Now, the good news is that commercial enteral formulas are designed to meet those basic micronutrient needs.
That's reassuring, at least.
But this review does suggest that it might be wise to consider providing extra, just as a precaution, like an insurance policy against deficiencies.
Yeah, an extra dose of those essential nutrients can't hurt, especially when we're not even sure how much they need. Okay, that's some seriously food for thought, no pun intended. As we wrap up this deep dive, any final thoughts for our listeners? Something to ponder as they go about their day?
Sure. Think about this. If our bodies are so incredibly adapted to handle periods of starvation, could there be an evolutionary advantage to the way our metabolism shifts during a critical illness?
Mhm.
An advantage that we haven't fully grasped yet. It really makes you think.
That's such a fascinating question. Like, what if those suppressed metabolic pathways, the ones that get switched off when we provide lots of external nutrients, what if those are actually protective in some way? We've still got so much to learn. Well, that is all the time we have for today's deep dive into the fascinating world of nutrition in the ICU. A huge thank you to you for walking us through this thought-provoking research and for challenging us to rethink what we thought we knew. And to you, listening, thanks for joining us on this journey of discovery. Until next time, keep those brains engaged and stay curious.